Thanks. All right, there we go. I'm Michael Bailey. You can find me on Twitter at Yogurt Earl. I'm a distinguished engineer on the mobile team at American Express. And today I'm talking about communicating for productivity. So why talk about communication? There's so many great talks here that are really focused on the data and the metrics and these deep technical details. And engineers are rightly focused on the data and the code. And we naturally all focus on metrics, code, technical details because we're engineers. And that's how we are trained. That's what gets us hired. That's what gets us promoted. And this is all very important, and there's so much great content here. But I wanted to take a moment just to remind us that how we communicate can really influence our productivity and challenge us to think a bit more about that. Communication is always a challenge, even one-on-one. There can be miscommunications with people. But as you scale, there's so many more interactions that communication becomes a bigger challenge. You've got managers talking to ICs, you've got product talking to engineering, mainframe developers talking to Android engineers, your CTOs talking to your new grads. And everybody brings their own context, they bring their own personality, their background, their goals and objectives to the conversation. And just thinking through how all these interactions happen, thinking how we can make people more productive through them, I think is something that we don't often think about as much because it can be harder to measure. And I don't really have any grand solutions, but just trying to challenge you to think about these things. Think about the way we can increase productivity by focusing on the way we communicate. So communication is harder to quantify than build times and things like that, but we can still look at common interactions and ways we communicate to look for ways to improve them and see how we're doing over time. And just because it's hard to measure doesn't mean we shouldn't try to figure out a way to improve it. And so we gravitate toward the things that are easier to measure, but we don't want to leave behind the things that may be a little bit harder to measure. And I've got a few examples here of, here's some personal statistics from a video meeting app that I use. And it tells me things like, did I join my meetings on time? How much dedicated focus did I get this week? And like chunks of time on my calendar so I could get real work done. Did I schedule meetings outside of other people's working hours, right? And I can look at these metrics personally over time. I can encourage people on my team to look at their own personal metrics in this way and think a little bit more about how these interactions are influencing their own productivity and the productivity of others on their team. One of the other things it shows me is how often I had my video on. And there's definitely circumstances where you don't want to have your video on if you're on a video meeting, but I think having it on at least some of the time can really bring a warmth and just a smile with a colleague over a video app that can really diffuse a conversation and really help you be more collaborative and get to a better solution for everybody. So to the extent that you're in a place and a time where you can turn your video on, I recommend it. Don't use metrics like this to be big brotherish. Use them to empower your team. It's not to micromanage your team, but get them thinking about how they can be a bit more productive in these ways. And one recommendation I would have is if you use video meeting apps, try turning off the little self-preview, the thing that mirrors yourself back, because looking at yourself all day can be really fatiguing. And so just try it like for a week, don't have that on, and see if you find the video meetings less fatiguing. Because when you're in in-person interactions, you don't have this constant like mirror staring back at yourself. So just give that a try. You can also find analytics in whatever chat application you happen to use and think about things of like, are people putting messages into channels? Are they doing too many DMs? Do we want to change that ratio over time? There's no right answer there, but just looking at the data and thinking about it can sort of help you understand how your team is working and how they're getting things done, and maybe there's a direction you want to go one way or the other. And again, don't micromanage, but use it to enable and empower and improve productivity. Another thing that I see that I try to use a lot, and I don't see people using it as much, is screenshots. When you're communicating with somebody through your chat app or other ways, a screenshot, can really be, as they say, picture worth 1,000 words. And it's a great way to communicate productivity. So use more screenshots. When you use them, use a tool that allows you to annotate them and add arrows and add circle things to really draw your point home on the screenshots. And make it a productive part of your workflow, something that's natural, something that you don't have to think, oh, how do I open the screenshot tool? And find some screenshot tool you like. There's free and open source ones out there, But learn the keyboard shortcut. So when you think, I'm about to make a message in a chat room or a PR or a bug report, it's just second nature to hit the keystroke to make a screenshot, maybe add a little bit of annotation, copy and paste, and you don't really have to go out of your normal workflow. Make it a part of your workflow with one of the many screenshot tools that are available out there. And screenshots can give a lot more context when you're having an interaction and avoid misunderstandings where maybe somebody's asking for help with, like, I can't get, I'm trying to do some version control thing in Git and it's not working the way they expect, but then they post a screenshot and you realize they're using some Git UI that you've never seen before, and that's sort of the crux of the thing. And maybe they failed to mention that otherwise, but once they posted a screenshot, you sort of get that context and move the conversation forward more quickly. Of course, you always want to include also a text description to make it searchable and accessible as well, in addition to the screenshot. Everybody from junior engineers to senior engineers needs help from their colleagues at times. You're using a new library, you're getting some bug, the test is failing, and you want to get help from a colleague. And that can be really an accelerator rather than just sort of trying and iterating for hours on your own. Somebody else who has the answer, has the experience, can really accelerate you by doing that. But when you're asking for help, a lot of times I see developers, they don't ask for help in a way that enables the other person to give them good help. So when you're asking for help, make it easy for that person to give you help. If there's somebody out there in your organization who has the answer and maybe they have the experience and they've seen that error message before, and they know what the fix is, if you ask in a way that allows them to help quickly in 5 to 10 minutes, they might be able to drop a message in a chat room to help you. Versus if you ask a poorly formed question, they might see it and say, I don't have time for that because they're too busy. So if you ask a good question, you're more likely to get a better response. So here's some ways that you can ask better questions. Give them a step-by-step repo instructions, especially internally. When you all have access to the same systems, the same source code, this should be fairly easy to do internally to sort of say, here's how I reproduce this issue step by step. Give them a link to the source code in question. Here's what I'm trying to do. It's not working. I don't understand this. I want some help with this. Push it to a branch. Give them a link to the source code in the message when you're asking for help. Don't just give them a code snippet. Give them a link to the code that you pushed. Even if this is code that maybe won't ultimately get merged and maybe won't ultimately go anywhere, but they just want feedback on it, open a PR to allow the person that's trying to help you to leave comments on each line. This line, I suggest this on this line, and on this other line, here's a place. Because when you give them a place to readily give you feedback line by line, a PR is a great way to do that, and they're maybe more likely to help, and it helps accelerate them when they're trying to give you help. A link to a failed CI job is great because it shows, hey, it's not specific to my machine, it's also happening on CI, and I tried to do the same thing on CI and was able to reproduce it. That can really speed up how quickly somebody can help you. Of course, give them the error message in plain text, give them a screenshot of the error, as I said before. Give them all the tools, the versions of the tools that you're using, so that they don't have to ask, right, for this. And so they have all the information to sort of dive right in to giving you help. Doing these things often leads to a self-solve. So by the time you get through this list, you've sort of answered your own question, which is great. And when you're doing this, if you give a link to a source code, use a permalink with the git hash in there and not a branch link, because it's more likely to be, when somebody finds it in search in the future, more likely to still be valid. And really avoid, if you're the person giving help, avoid playing 20 questions with people where they give you a little bit of information. Hey, I need help. What do you need help with? Well, this thing. Well, tell me more about that. And you're back and forth just to pull the information out of the person. Really, first take a step back and coach that person on how to ask good questions, because it'll help them in their career. It'll help your whole team. and have a document at your company to say, here's how we ask questions around here, and have it, it can be something like this or whatever the right way is at your company, and coach people on that. And really that will bring a lot of productivity to your team when people know how to ask good questions, and then they can get better help and you can give better help. Sometimes you're going back and forth in a chat room or a PR with somebody, and it's clear that they're just not, there's a lot more to go here. And it could be hours worth of back and forth with the person, but if you're able to jump on a pair programming tool and notice early as possible when the best way to resolve this is just to be able to jump on a tool like that, that's a great way to communicate. And there's a lot of tools out there that allow everybody to have sort of a cursor so they can point at things, or everybody can sort of type into a shared environment. And having that at the ready where it's not like everybody has it installed, everybody's ready to go with it, and a click of a button, you can just bring it up for everybody and quickly get past your issue and not have to think, oh, we want to get on something, how do we, what tool are we going to get on, and oh, you don't have this tool installed, and you're adding friction in the moment when that's just a distraction of what tool are we going to use. So prepare ahead of time with whatever tool you're going to use for these sorts of scenarios. Everything is code. So we do infrastructure as code and security as code, and your CI config is code in your repo. And increasingly you see this more, but why do we do these things? And I think we should do more things as code where possible. Well, when you put it into your repo, it gives more visibility. Anybody in your company can sort of see what have you done because it's right there in your repo. Anyone can propose a change, even if they're not on your team. They can open a pull request and say, hey, I want to change this thing. So that's another reason to try to put things as code or declaratively in your repos. It gives a record of the discussions that led up to that config in the pull request. When that config was initially added, you can go back and see why did we ended up with this way, look at the discussions. It makes things more reproducible that way, and it's not just oh, somebody clicked some buttons in some UI to establish this, here's the config in the repo that accomplished this task. It gives you a record of change. This config changed over time. What was it last week? What is it today? What is it next week? So you can see what changed rather than if it's not in the repo and somebody just did it locally with a command line tool on their laptop, or they did it through a UI, that can be a lot less visibility in there. And somebody from another team can come in and look at your config, copy the changes over to their repo if they want to do something similar to what you're doing. And it's a sort of documentation for when people leave too. So if somebody leaves and somebody comes in a year later, by having everything as code in your repo and the pull request that introduced that code and seeing the changes over time, it really gives a lot of context to those new people. So it's a great way of knowledge transfer from the old person to the new person, even if they didn't have any overlapping time at the company. So if you're not already doing it, put your documentation in Markdown in your repo. This leads to better documentation because you get a pull request review. So the person who's doing the review, assume they're reading the documentation, so you're getting more people reading your documentation because they have to do the pull request review. But you also get better documentation because people might have improvements and things that they can say along the way. I would say when you're doing this, make sure you have some sort of hard line limit on your Markdown because it makes it easier for people to give granular comments in a PR, right? If you have really long lines, then when you give a comment, it's on a whole block of text in your PR versus, okay, change this line or maybe make this improvement. So have line limits on your Markdown to make it easier to review in PRs. You can make your diagrams as code. There's things like Mermaid where you put it in Markdown and it turns it into a diagram for you. This is great because diagrams sometimes get out of date. They don't reflect the code. If you can automatically generate diagrams that sort of describe things, that's great. But if not, at least somebody can come along and say, hey, this diagram's out of date, and they can just submit a pull request to change and update the diagram. So another thing I want to take this sort of idea one step further is challenge you to think anytime you have a process where you have a developer sort of poking at a UI to change some server-side state, think first, how can we automate it? Maybe no developer needs to do it. But if you can't automate it, can we make it sort of as code in the repo? Make it declaratively in your repo. So as an example, the branch protection rules within your repo are not usually very discoverable for somebody who's not an admin. If you're not an admin, you can't see the current state of the branch protection rules in the repo. Maybe you want to propose a change. Well, it's hard to propose a change. You don't know the current state. And you might not even know who to bug or who the admins are to say, hey, can we change this branch rule or adjust this? Well, if you take something like this, and this is, normally it's just a dev sort of poking at a UI to change this state, and instead turn it to something as code, and there's, GitHub Actions out there where you can say, here's my branch protections, they're in my repo. Now everybody can see what the current state is. If they want to make a pull request to change something, propose a change, you can use code owners to make sure that, people can't change it without the proper approvals and lock it down in that way. But this really opens up that sort of communication, opens it up to the teams. And this sort of thinking of like, can we make things as code in the repo can apply to all sorts of things. So always sort of have that reflection or that reaction when I see this process of manual interactions and developers sort of poking at UI as part of their flow, can I just automate the whole thing away entirely? And if I can't, can I make it declarative sort of as code in the repo? And make these manual interactions as a metric. When you see as a developer process, something we know our developers are doing over and over, how many clicks is it taking them? How many keystrokes? And can we reduce that? Can we eliminate it altogether? But you can bring metrics to that sort of stuff and move it into your repos sort of as code. Another way we communicate is through error messages. So with error messages, I've seen a lot of range of unhelpful error messages to helpful error messages. And I'm going to take a look at a few examples here. But you generally want to, when you give an error message, give all the values that were and all the relevant inputs that led up to that error so people can see, like, why did I get this error? And then give advice on how to fix it, or here's a command that will allow you to fix it. So let's see a few examples of how we communicate through error messages. So here's an example. I did a Gradle W build here and got this sort of like, why is this failing on my machine? And it seemed to work fine on CI. Unresolved reference. It doesn't really tell me what the problem is here. Now, in this sort of cryptic message, it turns out that the issue was this particular property didn't exist till JDK 14, and I was running this on JDK 11. But it doesn't tell me that. It just says it can't find the thing. Well, a different message, you could modify your Gradle W to, if you know that you require JDK 17 or later or something like that, you can add something to your Gradle W to actually check that and give a much more helpful message. First, what was the problem? No compatible version of Java found. JDK 17 must be installed. So you're telling them what they need to do to fix it. And then you're giving a command right away, run this command, and they can fix it by themselves. And rather than a very cryptic message that somebody's going to have to go ask for help for, you just help them right in the moment there. Now, we could even improve this further by telling them what versions did we find in your system that weren't okay, and where did we go look for those versions, and put that into this error message. So even this could be improved. Another example, this error from running this benchmark script, conditional binary operator expected. Okay, well, that's not what, it didn't do what I wanted, just errored out with this very cryptic message. The problem here is that the version of Bash that comes with Mac OS is more than 10 years old. And so if you run it like this, you're going to get an error. But that's not obvious to a lot of developers what the problem is here. So you can actually write some code to check the version of Bash and give them a better message. So you could write some code like this that says what version of Bash you had. You need at least this version of Bash from the last 10 years. And that would print something like this. It tells them what was the input, the current version of Bash. What do they need? They need a newer version of Bash, let's say 4.2 or newer, and it tells them how to fix it. You can run brew install bash to get a newer version of Bash. So it really gives them sort of what was it, what did it need to be, and how to fix it. And so you can really unlock productivity with developers by communicating through these sort of error messages. Similar concept with test failure messages. So we often think about, we look at tests, you're doing a code review, you have your assertions at the end of the method, and you think, well, okay, this is asserting the right state, so it's a good test. Like when it succeeds, it actually is making sure that the system performed as expected. But we often don't think about, okay, when it fails, how useful is the error message that it's giving to the developer, and how much is it pointing to them? So think about that when you're doing a code review and you see the assertion message. Think about when this fails, what is the message going to be? And as an example, if you do a test like this, it's looking to see if this list contains New York. But when this fails, you're going to get a message that just says expected to be true. Okay, that's not going to be very helpful when you're trying to look through the error messages and figure out like where in the system it went wrong. Well, what expected what to be true? And through a not that big of a change, it looks similar in code review, but it can be easily missed. You could say this assertion instead, and which will then in turn give you a much more useful error message. It's expected to contain New York, but it was Phoenix and San Francisco, which then tells you like, okay, this list for some reason didn't contain what I was expecting it to contain. And so by really thinking when you look at code reviews that, how is this, what message is this going to give when it fails, and how can I make that more useful, you can really save people a lot of time down the road. You can also do things if it's a UI-based application, UI test, take a screenshot of the failure and put that in the output as well. And there's APIs on Android and things like that to do that if you're writing UI. All right, and that's all I had for you today. Oops. All right. So I want to thank you for coming. We are hiring. I work at American Express. Check out our career website, and just keep this in mind as you're doing developer productivity to make sure that you're thinking about the ways that you communicate, how you can communicate more effectively, and even if you can't measure it, there you can see how you can improve it over time. So thank you.